Hey guys, tonight we're pulling back the curtains on the strange, greasy, half-frozen world of World War II rations. Picture a muddy foxhole in 1944, a young GI peeling open a waxed cardboard box, squinting at a brown brick labelled Ration D, and quietly deciding he might rather starve. Settle in. Before you get comfortable, take a second to like and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy this. No pressure. Think of it less as an algorithm thing and more as joining a quiet little community of history-loving sleepers, all drifting off to the same slow voice. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is. I genuinely love reading those in the morning. Now, dim those lights, switch on a fan, pull your blanket up, get comfortable. Let your shoulders drop. Unclench your jaw. Yes, that jaw. The one you didn't know you were clenching. This one's going to run a little over 2 hours, designed to be listened to with your eyes closed, so there's no need to follow every word. Drift in, drift out. The narration will keep walking even if you don't. Nothing startling is going to happen. No loud music, no jump scares, just a steady voice leading you through strange wartime kitchens and greasy tin cans from 80 years ago. Take one slow exhale. We're going. Let's pause for a second. Have you ever wondered what a British soldier actually tasted when he bit into an oatmeal block? A compressed slab of oats meant to be a biscuit, but hard enough to chip a molar if you got impatient and tried to chew it dry? Have you ever wondered why American G is cursed the word spam with such venomous loyalty that General Eisenhower himself reportedly felt obliged, years later, to offer a half apology about it to Nikita Khrushchev? Have you ever wondered why Soviet soldiers freezing in the snow outside Stalingrad were handed exactly 100 grams of vodka a day by official decree? Or what a thin slice of cured pork fat, eaten on black bread with a clove of raw garlic, tastes like when it's the best thing you've had in a month? Have you ever wondered what pemmican really is? And why Canadian soldiers, famously polite, took one look at their ration version and quietly fed it to the sled dogs? Have you ever wondered why Japanese hardtack biscuits, called kanpan, came with tiny pastel sugar candies tucked into the packet? As if someone in a Tokyo factory had decided the tongue needed a little lie to keep going. Have you ever wondered what it's like to chew a square of chocolate laced with methamphetamine while your tank rolls through France? Or why Australian troops in the North African desert allegedly buried whole crates of tinned mutton rather than eat it? And why, decades later, archaeologists keep finding those sad little graves? Why did British soldiers call their stew M&V with such venom? Why was a 4-ounce chocolate bar officially designed to taste only slightly better than a boiled potato? And, perhaps the most important question of all, what on earth does baby's head pudding actually look like when you turn it out of the tin? Tonight, we answer all of it, gently, one ration tin at a time. Congratulations. You've just woken up in 1942. The hum of modern life fades behind you like the drone of a distant propeller, and in its place comes the smell of coal smoke, damp canvas and cardboard that has been sitting in a warehouse too long. You're standing in a quartermaster's depot somewhere behind the lines, under a single bare bulb, surrounded by stacks of olive-drab tins, waxed cartons, and burlap sacks of powdered egg taller than you are. Somewhere, a clipboard is being slapped against a thigh. Somewhere else, a mess tin clinks against a belt buckle. A sergeant is shouting something about a Minneapolis laboratory, and a physiologist named Ancel Keys. And he is going to hand you, personally, the very first box. Good luck. So, let's start with that box, because it has a surprisingly specific origin story. And it begins not on a battlefield, but in a grocery store in Minneapolis in 1941. The man holding the shopping basket is Dr. Ancel Keys, a physiologist at the University of Minnesota. If that name rings any distant bell, it's because Keys would go on to become one of the most famous nutritional scientists of the 20th century. The man behind the Minnesota starvation experiment, the man who decades later would essentially invent the Mediterranean diet. But in 1941, he's just a busy academic who has been handed a deeply unglamorous assignment by the US War Department. They need a ration. Specifically, they need a ration for paratroopers, men who, by the nature of their job, were going to be dropped out of airplanes with no kitchen, no cook, no supply line, and no particular guarantee of seeing another human being with food for anywhere from a few hours to a few days. The ration had to be lightweight. It had to survive a parachute drop. It had to survive a hot summer and a cold winter. And it had to, in theory, keep a healthy young man alive and functional long enough to do something useful. So Keys did what any sensible professor with a government grant would do. He went shopping. He walked the aisles of a Minneapolis grocery store with a pencil and a list, and he assembled, for a grand total of around 50 cents, the prototype of what would become the K-ration. Hard biscuits, dry sausage, hard candy, a bar of chocolate, a tin of something. That was essentially it. He tested it on paratroopers in field trials. They didn't immediately die, and the army, in its usual way, nodded solemnly, stamped it, approved, and then scaled it up to a scale Keys himself probably never imagined. By the end of the war, over 100 million K-ration meals would be issued. That 50-cent grocery run in Minnesota became the single most distributed meal design in American military history. Here is what they handed you, soldier. 3 waxed cardboard boxes a day, each roughly the size of a Cracker Jack box, each one labeled with the time of day it was meant for. Breakfast, dinner, which meant lunch because the army is allergic to clarity, and supper. The boxes were coated in paraffin wax, partly to waterproof them, and partly so that, in a pinch, you could set the box itself on fire and use it as a little stove to heat the can inside, which is, when you think about it, a really elegant piece of design, and also the most American solution imaginable. The packaging is the fuel. Inside each box, the choreography was roughly the same. There was a can. The can was the star of the show, and the star of the show was, depending on the meal and the year, something different, and almost always something suspicious. Breakfast usually gave you a tin of chopped ham and egg, which sounds fine, even pleasant, until you actually met it. It was pale, slick, pink-flecked, and the egg portion had the unsettling habit of separating into little rubbery yellow cubes suspended in something you could only generously call aspic. It tasted, most veterans agreed, the way a pet store smells. Dinner gave you a tin of processed cheese, and here, against all odds, the army actually got one right. The canned cheese was dense and salty and genuinely palatable, and, this is the beautiful part, it could be warmed up by setting the can on a Jeep engine for a few minutes while you drove. A slow crawl through the Italian countryside was, for the cheese-eating GI, essentially a mobile toaster oven. Some versions came with bacon, some with pimentos, and all of them were weirdly beloved. When you ask old G is today what the best thing in a K-ration was, a startling number of them, with a faraway look, will say the cheese. And then there was supper, which was where the trouble started. Supper gave you what the quartermaster corps, in its official paperwork, called the meat unit. The meat unit was a block of pressed, gelatinous, pork-based something that sat in its tin surrounded by a faint ring of translucent jelly. And it came out onto your mess tin with the gentle suck of a thing that did not want to leave. It was officially a pork loaf. Unofficially, it was mystery meat, or the loaf, or a range of names not suitable for a channel designed to help you fall asleep. Its texture sat somewhere between wet meatloaf and a very firm pudding. Its taste sat somewhere between salt, fat, and regret. G is hated it, really hated it. Hated it so much that as they moved through liberated France and Italy in 1944, the meat unit became one of the single most important unofficial currencies of the war. A French farmer would not take American dollars. He was skeptical of francs. But he would absolutely trade you a fresh egg, a bottle of wine, a hunk of real bread, or a wedge of actual cheese for an American pork loaf in a tin. Because to him, it was a miracle. To you, it was Tuesday. Around that central can, the designers packed in a little kit of small pleasures and small necessities. And this is where the K-ration really reveals its personality. There were 4 cigarettes, Chesterfields or Luckies or Camels, depending on the lot. Because in 1943, the army considered nicotine a basic human right. There was a stick of chewing gum. There was a small fruit bar, pressed dried fruit held together with sugar, which soldiers generally liked. There were sugar tablets, or sometimes a little envelope of instant coffee, or a bouillon cube for heating into broth. There was a tiny packet of toilet paper, because someone, somewhere, in an office in Washington, had thought that far ahead, and bless them. And there was a flat wooden spoon, the kind you still sometimes get with ice cream, which was simultaneously your utensil, and, in emergencies, a tongue depressor, a splinter, or a game piece. All of that, in a box roughly the size of your phone. Now, the problem with the K-ration, and indeed with all of them, was never really the first day. The first day of any ration is fine. Novelty is a wonderful seasoning. The second day is a little less fine. The third day, the fourth day, the 20th day, the 80th day. That's where the real horror begins. The army called it ration fatigue, which is an extraordinary piece of bureaucratic understatement for what was, in reality, a slow psychological unraveling. On Guadalcanal, in late 1942, Marines were eating the same tinned meat and beans for weeks on end, and men who had been cheerfully shoveling it down in October were, by December, physically unable to put it in their mouths. Their bodies simply refused. They would open the can, smell it, and their gorge would rise. Some of them went hungry rather than eat it. Some of them traded it for anything. Some of them just stared at it for a while, and then quietly buried it, which is a reaction I think we can all understand. This, by the way, is why the military eventually became obsessed with variety, because they learned, in the hardest way possible, that a calorie a soldier refuses to eat is not a calorie at all. Which brings us, naturally, to Spam. Spam was not actually a K-ration item per se. It was issued separately in its own blue and yellow tins to American troops, and also, via Lend-Lease, to British, Australian and Soviet forces, by the literal hundreds of millions of pounds. Hormel had introduced Spam to the civilian world in 1937 as spiced ham, the name a contraction, the recipe a mixture of pork shoulder, ham, salt, water, sugar and sodium nitrite. It was cheap. It was shelf-stable. It travelled anywhere. It was, in effect, the perfect war food, and the war absolutely ate it. Soviet soldiers, handed tins of Spam by the shipload under Lend-Lease, called it Roosevelt sausage, Tushonka Roosevelta. And Nikita Khrushchev, writing decades later, would genuinely credit it with saving the Red Army. "Without Spam," he said, "we wouldn't have been able to feed our army." Which is an astonishing sentence when you sit with it. The tide of the Eastern Front partially turning on a pink loaf from Minnesota. American GIs, however, did not feel quite so warm about it. They ate Spam fried for breakfast, Spam sliced for lunch, Spam baked for dinner, Spam cold when there was no fuel, Spam diced into stew, Spam cubed into so-called salad, Spam as sandwich, Spam as hash, Spam as the meat in a pie, Spam as the meat in not a pie. By 1944, the word itself had become a curse. Letters home mentioned it with a kind of resigned poetry. And General Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, the man who planned D-Day, apparently felt compelled, years after the war, during a personal meeting with Khrushchev, to offer a semi-formal apology for how much Spam he had made Americans eat. He reportedly added that he had eaten so much of it himself that he never, ever wanted to see another tin. This is the rare historical moment where the leader of the free world personally takes the L on a luncheon meat. And yet, here is the quietly funny part. Wherever American troops went, Spam left its ghost behind. In Hawaii, where thousands of troops were stationed and where Spam became a household staple because fresh meat was rationed, it simply never left. Today, you can walk into any Hawaiian 7-Eleven and buy Spam musubi, a slice of fried Spam on a pad of rice, wrapped in a strip of nori like a tiny salty sushi. And you are eating, genuinely, a direct edible descendant of 1943. The war is literally in the lunchbox. Now step down one rung of the ration ladder, because the K-ration's bigger, heavier, angrier cousin was the C-ration. Where the K was designed to be carried in a pocket and eaten on the move, the C-ration was meant for troops in more stable positions, men who might actually get to sit down to eat, more or less. It came in 6-ounce cans, heavy enough to use as a small weapon in a pinch, and it came in roughly 3 flavors: meat and beans, meat and hash, and the immortal meat and vegetable stew. That was it. For years, let that sink in. For years. On Guadalcanal, troops ate nothing but meat and beans, meat and beans, meat and beans, sometimes for weeks together, until the sight of the tin itself, the dull olive paint, the raised ridges, the pull tab, could genuinely make a grown man cry. One Marine described opening a C-ration and feeling his hands shake not from fear, but from sheer weariness of the thing. Later in the war, the Army did expand the menu, adding things like corned beef hash, sausage patties, spaghetti. But for the men at the sharp end of 1942 and 1943, the C-ration was a 3-note songs played on repeat until the melody broke them. And finally, because we can't leave this section without talking about it, let's address the brick, the Ration D-bar. The Ration D-bar was introduced in 1937, designed jointly by Captain Paul Logan of the U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps and Sam Hinkle, the chief chemist of the Hershey Chocolate Company in Pennsylvania. And I want you to understand this, because it's important. The army did not want this bar to be delicious. They very specifically, very explicitly in writing, did not want this. Captain Logan's instructions to Hershey were legendary, and I'm paraphrasing only slightly. The bar, he said, must weigh 4 ounces. It must survive temperatures up to 120 degrees Fahrenheit without melting. It must contain at least 600 calories, and it must taste, and I quote, a little better than a boiled potato. That last instruction was the critical one, because if the bar tasted too good, soldiers would just eat it. They would sit down in the morning, open their emergency ration, and scarf a day's worth of calories as a snack. So Hershey's chemists, under these bizarre constraints, engineered something truly singular. A brick of oat flour, cocoa, sugar, skim milk powder, and a touch of vanillin, pressed together under such pressure that the result was not so much chocolate as a dense, waxy geological formation that happened to be brown. It was so hard it couldn't be bitten cleanly. Soldiers were officially instructed to shave thin slices off with a knife and let them dissolve slowly in the mouth. In the field, a knife frequently meant a bayonet, which is how we arrive at the astonishing, perfectly true historical image of American G, who is in Europe using a blade designed for hand-to-hand combat to shave curls of chocolate off a survival brick. They called it, with their usual flair, Hitler's secret weapon, because it broke teeth, because it caused in bulk a stunning and democratic constipation, because it sat in the stomach with a kind of accusatory weight, and because, on the rare occasions a soldier ate it hungry and hot, it tasted, exactly as promised, only slightly better than a boiled potato. And yet, I want you to hold on to one more image before we move on, because I think it says everything about the K-ration and the men who ate it. A young American infantryman in a Normandy hedgerow, summer 1944. The bocage high and green around him, the smell of crushed grass and diesel and distant smoke. He has a waxed box open on his knee. In his hand is the meat unit, that pale, jellied, defeated-looking loaf, and in front of him, across a low stone wall, is a French farmer holding a single fresh egg. Not a dozen. One. Brown-shelled, warm from the henhouse, still faintly streaked with straw. They trade, silently. A deep nod, a half smile, the kind of transaction that doesn't need language. The farmer walks back to his kitchen, clutching a miracle. The soldier cracks the egg onto his mess tin, watches the yolk spread gold against the metal, and eats it raw in 2 swallows, because he does not trust his luck long enough to build a fire. That egg, he would later write, was the best meal of the war, which tells you really everything you need to know about the K-ration. But that was only the American story. Across the channel, a different army was opening a very different tin. And that tin, more often than not, was trapezoidal, which is, if you think about it, a genuinely strange choice of shape for a can. Not cylindrical like a proper American tin, not square, but trapezoidal, wider at the top than at the bottom, with gently sloping sides, like a tiny brass coffin for a small and defeated animal. You would recognize it the moment you saw one, because the British and Commonwealth armies carried it in their pockets, in their packs, in their mess tins, and in their nightmares for the better part of half a century. This was the tin of bully beef, and inside it was a pink, pressed, faintly jellied brick of corned beef that somehow managed to be both the cornerstone of an empire's wartime diet and a running joke for every soldier who ever had to eat it. The name bully was not, as you might reasonably assume, a comment on the beef's character. It was a corruption of the French bouilli, boiled. And the tin itself went back to the Boer War, had served through the whole of the First World War, and by 1939 had settled into the British military consciousness the way porridge settles into oatmeal. It was simply there. It was always there. The bulk of it was produced by Frei Bentos, a company whose enormous meat-packing plant sat on the banks of the Uruguay River in, appropriately enough, the town of Frei Bentos, Uruguay. And from that single South American town flowed an absolutely extraordinary river of pressed beef, millions upon millions of tins, crated onto ships and dispatched to every corner of the British war, from the beaches of Normandy to the sands of El Alamein to the frozen decks of Arctic convoys. If the American war moved on spam, the British war moved on bully beef. And both wars, quietly, moved on the same basic idea. Take a pig or a cow, reduce it to salt and memory, seal it in metal and hand it to a man with a rifle. Opening a tin of bully was a small ritual in itself. You would find, folded flat against the side of the can, a little metal key, like the key that still, occasionally, unrolls a tin of sardines. And you would slot the tab of the lid into the slot of the key and turn and turn and turn, winding the metal up into a tight brass spiral while the seal peeled slowly back with a thin, sharp sigh. In the desert, if the temperature outside was high enough, the jelly inside would already have melted into a warm pink oil, and when you tipped the tin, the whole brick of beef would slide out onto your mess tin like a thing ashamed of itself, glistening with fat, quivering faintly. You could eat it cold, in which case it tasted like very salty sorrow. You could fry it, assuming you had any way to make fire, in which case it crisped at the edges and became something almost genuinely good. Or you could chop it into a billy can with biscuit and onion and water and call it stew and thank whatever god you still believed in. The usual way to make that fire, by the way, was on a little contraption called the Tommy cooker, a small folding tin stove that burned pellets of hexamine fuel, a solid, waxy-looking compound that hissed as it ignited and gave off a flame so blue and so apologetic it could barely boil a cup of tea in under 20 minutes. The smell of hexamine is one of the unsung smells of the Second World War. It is sharp, slightly medicinal, not quite unpleasant. And for anyone who lived through that war on the British side, it was the smell of rest, the smell of a halt, a brew-up, a moment of not being shot at. If you had a Tommy cooker and a billy can and a tin of bully beef, you had, for a few minutes, a home. Now, the bully beef was the simple part, because in 1942 the British Army introduced something far more ambitious and far more infamous, called the 14-man Compo ration pack. The Compo was a wooden crate, rough sawn and wire-bound, designed to feed either 14 men for one day, or, if you were very, very unlucky, one man for 14 days. It came in 7 variants, labelled simply by letter: Menu A, Menu B, Menu C, Menu D, Menu E, Menu F, Menu G. And part of the grim lottery of British Army life was the moment a quartermaster dropped a crate at your section's feet and you all crowded in to see which letter had been stenciled on the side. Some letters were good. Menu A, I'm told, was widely considered tolerable. Menu C was fine. Menu D was the one nobody wanted. Menu D was the one with the steak and kidney pudding. You have to understand what a British steak and kidney pudding is supposed to be. In its civilian form, it is a sweet pastry dome, warm and golden. Split open to reveal chunks of beef and kidneys swimming in dark gravy, a thing of pubs and rainy Sundays and proper forks. What came out of the compo tin was something else. It was a grey-pink dome of congealed sweet, wrapped around cubes of something that had once, distantly, been animal, held together by a jelly the colour of old dishwater. When you turned it out of the tin, it slid onto the plate with a soft, reluctant sound, and sat there, pale and round and faintly glistening, and every British Tommy who ever saw one gave it the same nickname. They called it baby's head, because that was what it looked like. A small, wrinkled, pink, entirely unmoving baby's head, on a tin plate, in the rain. And you were expected to eat it with a spoon. The same crate would contain tins of M and V, meat and vegetable, which was, in theory, a hearty stew of beef chunks, potatoes, carrots and onions, and, in practice, a pale beige liquid with occasional grey lumps in it that may or may not have once been any of those ingredients. British soldiers pronounced the letters M and V with a venom normally reserved for X's and war profiteers. Some of them insisted the V stood for nothing at all. You could eat it. You would eat it. But you would not be happy about it, and in your diary that night you would say something unkind. Then there were the biscuits. And here we have to pause, because the word biscuit in this context does the English language a genuine disservice. A compo biscuit was not a biscuit. A compo biscuit was a small, square, pale, extraordinarily dense slab of baked flour and water, stamped out of the same historical tradition as medieval hardtack and ship's biscuit. And in some regiments, it was still, quite openly, called dog biscuit. It was hard enough, reliably, to break a molar. It was hard enough that men chipped teeth on them and had to see the regimental dentist and explain, with a certain embarrassment, what they had been chewing. The official instruction was to soak it in tea for 20 minutes before attempting to eat it. 20 minutes. In the desert, in the rain, under shell fire, you were expected to dunk your biscuit in your mug and wait a third of an hour for geology to become food. In practice, soldiers developed an entire subculture of biscuit engineering. You could crumble it into your stew to thicken it. You could pound it to powder and mix it with condensed milk to make a kind of sweet grey paste that some men, in the absence of better options, called pudding. And in the most celebrated of all British ration hacks, you could soak a biscuit in condensed milk overnight, and by morning it would have absorbed enough sweetness to resemble almost, something like cake, or if not cake, at least the memory of cake. On top of the biscuit came the oatmeal block, a compressed rectangle of oats, designed to be crumbled into boiling water to make porridge, and often eaten dry by desperate or impatient men, which was, I regret to tell you, another reliable way to break a tooth. And then, somewhere in the compo crate, you would find the soya links. I am sorry in advance for what I am about to describe. Soya links were sausages, and I use the word sausages the way British Army rations used the word biscuit, which is to say with generous imagination. They were made from textured soy protein, dyed a suspect grey-brown, with a rubbery skin and an aroma that hovered somewhere between burnt hair, egg gone wrong, and wet dog. When you fried one, the smell rose up, and it was the kind of smell that made other soldiers in the billet turn their heads and silently re-evaluate their life choices. British troops in Italy, according to reliable testimony, sometimes threw them at the Germans rather than eat them. Whether this was an accurate account of the enemy's morale collapse or simply the cheerful exaggeration of veterans at a reunion is lost to history. But the fact that the joke existed at all tells you everything you need to know about the Sawyer link. And yet, wrapped around all this bleak inventory, the baby's head, the M and V, the biscuit, the Sawyer link, was the one thing that never failed. The one thing that genuinely, quietly, stubbornly held the British war effort together. And that thing, as you will have guessed, was tea. Every compo pack contained a large tin of compo tea, a pre-mixed powder of black tea leaves, powdered milk, and sugar, all combined into a single dusty grey product. That, when dumped into boiling water, became a sweet, milky, strong, enormously comforting brew. You did not add anything. You did not need anything. You just tipped and stirred and drank. It tasted faintly of tin. Everything British in the war tasted faintly of tin. But it was hot, and it was sweet, and it was tea. And after enough months of eating from cans, that was often the difference between a man who could still function and a man who had simply stopped. There is a reason that in every single set of Commonwealth war memoirs you will ever read, the words "brew up" appear more often than the word "rifle." It was not sentiment, it was fuel. Meanwhile, in North Africa, the Australians were fighting their own small, fierce war with their own small, fierce tin. Australian troops received large quantities of tinned mutton shipped in from Argentina, and it was, by every account I have ever read, genuinely awful. Fatty, gamey, salty in a way that suggested someone had dropped the salt shaker and refused to admit it. The legend, and I cannot swear to every detail of it, but the story has been told by enough old diggers that there must be truth in it somewhere, is that entire cases of Argentine mutton were, in places, buried in the desert sand rather than eaten, and that years later, archaeologists and military historians have, in fact, occasionally stumbled across these unopened caches, still trapezoidal, still sealed, still, presumably, delicious. The rats of Tobruk, besieged Australians holed up in that Libyan port in 1941, survived for months on bully beef, biscuit, and captured Italian supplies, and developed, surprising exactly no one, a deep affection for Italian tinned sardines and Italian tinned cheese, which were, compared to their own rations, a kind of Mediterranean miracle. We also have to talk, softly, about the Indian Army. Because the Indian Army was enormous, over 2.5 million men by the end of the war, the largest volunteer army in history. And feeding it was an extraordinary logistical problem. The ration system had to accommodate Hindu soldiers who would not eat beef, Muslim soldiers who required halal slaughter and would not eat pork, Sikh soldiers, Gurkhas who traditionally preferred goat meat, and dozens of other regional and religious preferences, all at once, across theatres from East Africa to Burma. Indian rations included atta flour for chapatis, dal, ghee, rice, salt and spices, culturally correct for the most part when the supply chain cooperated. But the supply chain did not always cooperate, and there are grim, quietly infuriating stories of Indian troops being issued British bully beef in emergencies, a tin that a Hindu soldier could not in good conscience eat, a tin that a Muslim soldier could not accept as halal, a tin that was, at that moment, the only protein on the shelf. This was not generally deliberate cruelty. It was the blundering of a bureaucracy that did not always remember whom it was feeding. But it caused, understandably, serious morale issues, and the British officers who noticed and adjusted for it were the ones whose Indian regiments fought best. And behind all of this, woven through the whole vast tapestry of the British war, was the NAAFY, the Navy, Army and Air Force Institutes, the cheerful, slightly shambolic network of canteens and mobile vans that followed British troops more or less everywhere they went, and sold them the things no ration could provide. Cigarettes, real tea in a mug poured by an actual woman in an actual apron, Cadbury chocolate when there was Cadbury chocolate, biscuits that were not dog biscuits, newspapers, soap, the small, crucial human comforts. A NAAFI van pulling into a field camp was, for many Tommies, a sight as welcome as mail from home. In memoirs, when veterans wanted to describe a moment of unexpected grace in an otherwise grim stretch, they would almost always, at some point, mention the NAAFI. But here is where I want to leave you, because I think it says more than any inventory of tins. A British private, Italian campaign. Autumn 1944. He is billeted in a stone farmhouse somewhere south of Florence, the kind of thatched, shutter-hinged place that has seen 4 centuries of weather and is unimpressed by another war. Outside, it is raining in that Italian way that is colder than it has any right to be. Inside, on the flagstones, he has his mess tin and his compo crate, and today, through no fault of his own, he has drawn menu D. He holds the tin over the mess tin, and he turns it, and out slides the steak and kidney pudding, grey, round, wrinkled, quietly offended by its own existence. He stares at it for a long time. He thinks perhaps of his mother's kitchen in Sheffield, or Liverpool, or Kent. He thinks perhaps of what a proper steak and kidney pudding looks like, and of when he last had one, and of whether he ever will again. And then he notices at his ankle a thin, cautious, hopeful stray dog. Some small Italian hound that has been surviving on the edges of armies for 3 years and has learned the specific posture of a tired man with food. He looks at the dog. The dog looks at him. The rain keeps falling. And quietly, without ceremony, he tips the baby's head off his mess tin and onto the stone floor. The dog eats with dignity. The private boils the kettle for tea. Across the Eastern Front, meanwhile, another army was doing something stranger, harder, and in its own way more astonishing with far, far less. Because the Red Army, in 1941, in 1942, in the winters that broke European armies and the summers that baked them into the steppe, was fighting a war on a scale and in a climate that most quartermasters in London or Washington could barely imagine. The German invasion in June of 1941, Operation Barbarossa, did not just crash into the Soviet border. It crashed into the Soviet food supply. The great grain belts of Ukraine, the farms of Belarusia, the livestock of the western oblasts, the warehouses, the flour mills, the railway hubs through which peacetime food had moved. All of it was, within weeks, behind German lines, or on fire, or both. And the Red Army suddenly had to feed itself from what was left, which was, to put it gently, not enough. On paper, the Soviet frontline soldiers' daily ration was actually quite generous, and I want to read it to you because it has the specific, slightly sad beauty of a list written by planners who meant well. 800 grams of rye bread in summer, 900 grams in winter, 500 grams of potatoes, 170 grams of meat or fish, 150 grams of groats, buckwheat or millet or sometimes oats, sugar, salt, tea, macorka tobacco, a little vegetable fat. On paper, it was enough to keep a grown man fighting in the snow. In practice, for long stretches of the war, a Soviet soldier was very lucky if he saw half of it. What he actually got most days was bread and kasha. Bread and kasha. Bread, and if the field kitchen had managed to reach his position, kasha. And if it hadn't, just bread. And sometimes not even that. Let us talk about the bread, because Soviet black bread deserves its own quiet hymn. It was rye, sour, dense in a way that made British national loaf seem airy, baked into enormous dark loaves that felt in the hand more like masonry than food. In good times, it was wonderful, a genuine peasant bread with centuries of tradition behind it, eaten with salt and garlic and a thin sliver of anything fatty you could find. In bad times, though, bakers cut it with whatever was available: bran, cattle feed, potato peel, sawdust, in the worst stretches, in the worst places. The Leningrad bakers in the siege did things to bread that no bread should have been asked to do, stretching a handful of real flour with cellulose and cottonseed cake and hydrolyzed birch bark, and calling the result with a flat administrative honesty that still chills me: Blokadny chleb, blockade bread. 125 grams per day for civilians at the worst point. 125 grams. That is a slice, barely a slice. And people lived on it, and many people died on it. And the bakers who kept the ovens going through the starvation winter of 1941 and 1942 were themselves starving. There is a particular photograph you can find, if you go looking, of a small dark cube of blockade bread in a museum case in St. Petersburg, and it is the size of a matchbox, and it is what a human being had for an entire day. I am not going to dwell on it, but I want you to know it existed. Out at the front, the soldiers' bread was better than that, but not by as much as you might hope. It was usually brought up frozen. In the winter of 1941, bread was baked far in the rear, frozen solid on the way to the line, and handed out in rock-hard bricks that men warmed against their bodies or hacked apart with bayonets. A frozen loaf could, famously, stop a rifle bullet at a bad enough angle, which was a fact Red Army men joked about with the particular bleakness that is native to that army. You chewed it slowly while it thawed in your mouth. You tried not to think about it too hard. Alongside the bread, when the soldier was blessed, came kasha. Kasha is a word that in Russian does not really mean porridge the way English speakers hear the word. Kasha is a civilization. It is buckwheat or millet or barley, cooked in water or broth until it swells into a thick, nutty, slightly earthy grain pile that has been the backbone of Russian peasant eating for 1,000 years. In the Red Army, kasha was cooked in the WW2 kuchnia, the field kitchen. And the field kitchen was, genuinely, one of the most beloved pieces of equipment in the Soviet war. It was a wheeled stove, pulled by horses, topped with enormous black cauldrons, and the cooks who manned it, often older men, often wounded veterans reassigned to rear duties, developed the same quiet authority as battlefield priests. Where the WW2 kuchnia went, hot food followed. Where it did not go, men ate whatever they could open with a knife. The steam from its chimney rising into the grey afternoon was, for many Red Army soldiers, the single most beautiful sight of the war, and I do not say that lightly. If kasha was the backbone, salo was the heart. Salo is cured pork back fat. Pure, thick, creamy slabs of white, salted, sometimes smoked, sometimes rubbed with garlic, wrapped in cheesecloth, and kept in a man's pack like treasure. Because it was treasure. Salo, eaten in thin slices on black bread with a raw clove of garlic and maybe a cold green onion, was the single most prized ration item on the Eastern Front. Soldiers gifted slices of salo to their friends. They sent salo home in letters wrapped in brown paper. Mothers and grandmothers sent salo to the front in packages tucked between socks and tobacco. And when a man received salo from home, the whole dugout knew, and every man in that dugout would somehow, quietly, end up with a sliver of it on his tongue before the night was out. To a Western palate, pure pork fat on sour bread with raw garlic might sound like an affliction. To a Red Army soldier at 20 below zero, chewing salo on black bread was genuinely happiness. It burned slow. It kept the cold out of the bones. It tasted of home and of peace, and of the particular grandmother who had cured it. Then, alongside the salo and the kasha and the bread, there was tushonka. Tushonka is canned stewed meat, pork or beef, simmered in its own fat with bay leaves and salt until it falls apart and sealed in a tin. It was the Soviet answer to Spam, and in good times it was, honestly, rather wonderful. Spread on bread, spooned into kasha, crumbled into soup. Tushonka was the meat the Red Army actually ate. Some of it was produced domestically in Soviet plants, but an enormous amount of it, truly staggering quantities, came from the United States through Lend-Lease. Over 4 million tons of food aid flowed from American ports to Soviet ones during the war, and a huge portion of it was canned meat, lard, wheat flour, sugar, and powdered eggs. Spam arrived in Soviet hands by the trainload, and Soviet soldiers, with their genius for nicknames, called it Roosevelt sausage, which is, I think, one of the best names for Spam ever invented by anyone. Khrushchev himself, years later, said plainly that without Spam there would have been nothing to feed the army on the march to Berlin. Stalin, never one for excessive gratitude, reportedly joked at a dinner with Western diplomats that Lend-Lease canned meat had fed his soldiers all the way to the Brandenburg Gate. It was, uncharacteristically, the truth. Not all of the American food was loved. Powdered eggs arrived in yellow tins, and Soviet soldiers, who had never before met powdered eggs, reconstituted them with cold water and tasted the sulphurous, faintly soapy result, and collectively, from the Baltic to the Caucasus, made the face. They called it soap eggs. They ate it anyway, because you do not throw away food on the Eastern Front. But they did not forgive it. Even stranger were the jars of American peanut butter that arrived in some Lend-Lease shipments. Peanut butter did not exist in the Soviet culinary imagination. There was no category for it. Soviet soldiers opened these jars, sniffed at the brown paste, tasted it, and decided, in at least a few documented cases, that it must be some kind of machine grease. There are stories, and I cannot vouch for every one of them, but the pattern is consistent enough that the truth must be in there, of Soviet mechanics using American peanut butter as axle grease on wagon wheels and gun carriages. It apparently worked fine, which tells you something about Soviet improvisation and something about the thickness of wartime peanut butter. And then, threading through all of this, there was Narcom's 100, 100 grams of vodka per man per day. At the front. It began by decree of the State Defense Committee in August of 1941, in the middle of the catastrophe, on the recommendation, or at least under the administrative authority, of Anastas Mikoyan, the People's Commissar of Food Industry, and the Russian word for a commissar of that sort is narkom. So 100 grams from the narkom, narkom's 100, narkomovsky 100 gram. It became the most famous, most argued over, most mythologized ration item in the entire Red Army. The idea was partly medical, warmth, anesthesia against fear, and partly psychological, and partly, frankly, cultural. Russian soldiers drank vodka. Russian soldiers had always drunk vodka. Giving them a small official daily measure of it, poured from a large aluminum can by a stern-faced sergeant into a tin cup before an attack, was a gesture that everyone in the chain of command understood. You did not have to explain Narkom's 100 to anyone. You just poured it. Some men drank it. Some men saved it. Some men, famously, traded it. For an extra hunk of bread, for a spoon of sugar, for a cigarette, for a letter-writing favor. Teetotalers and Muslim soldiers from the Central Asian republics often traded their 100 grams to Russian or Ukrainian comrades in exchange for sweet things, and an entire informal economy ran on these trades. Before an assault, the 100 grams was poured heavier, sometimes doubled, sometimes more. After an assault, for the survivors, it was poured again. Russian veterans, decades after the war, would sit at Victory Day tables on the 9th of May and pour themselves exactly 100 grams, no more, no less, and drink it slowly and silently, and think about the men who had poured it with them and were not at the table anymore. You can still see this done in kitchens in Russia and Ukraine and Belarus and Kazakhstan today. The ration outlived the war, and above all of it, stubbornly, there was makorka. Makorka was the rough, cheap tobacco of the Russian soldier, a coarse-cut leaf from a particular hardy tobacco plant, harsh, strong, and issued with rations in small paper twists. There were no cigarettes. There was just the makorka and a scrap of newspaper, usually Pravda or the local front newspaper, which you tore into strips and rolled into cones and filled with the stinking brown leaf and smoked in the dark of a dugout with the other men, and the smoke was blue and stinging, and it smelled, faintly, of burnt tar and home. The Russian phrase for a hand-rolled makorka cigarette was kozya nozhka, a goat's leg, because of its crooked, tapered shape. Men rolled kozya nozhka cigarettes between their fingers while they waited for orders, while they waited for bread, while they waited for the field kitchen to catch up, while they waited for the war to end. And so, if you want to know what a Red Army soldier tasted on the Eastern Front, the answer is layered and specific, and not at all like a tidy Western ration tin. You tasted sour rye bread, sometimes frozen, sometimes stretched with things that should not have been in bread. You tasted buckwheat kasha from a horse-drawn cauldron. You tasted sallow on a piece of bread with a clove of raw garlic, and you tasted, faintly, the hands of whoever had salted it for you. You tasted Roosevelt sausage, sliced cold. You tasted, on a good day, a spoonful of American sugar. You tasted the harsh sting of makorka in your throat. And you tasted, before the attack, a measured 100 grams of vodka, cold and clean and burning, poured out of a battered aluminum can into a battered tin cup by a sergeant whose face you already half knew you might not see again. I want to leave you with a particular image, because it is the one that keeps coming back to me whenever I read about the Soviet ration system. February of 1943, outside Stalingrad. The German Sixth Army has just surrendered. The city behind your shoulder is a wreckage of brick and smoke and bodies under snow. You are a Red Army soldier, 22 years old, from a village outside Voronezh that you have not seen in 18 months. You are standing in line, in the particular blue cold of a Russian winter dusk, in front of a polevaya kuknya. Its chimney is sending a slow grey column of steam into the sky. The cook, a tired older man with a thick moustache and a scar along his jaw, is ladling buckwheat kasha with a lump of tushonka into each tin as it is held out. Behind him, another sergeant is pouring exactly 100 grams of vodka into each man's cup, with the absolute concentration of a priest pouring sacrament. You hold out your mess tin. The steam of the kasha rises into your face and fogs your eyelashes. The cook nods at you without smiling. He gives you an extra spoonful. Behind him, the sergeant pours your 100 grams. You walk 3 steps away and you stand in the snow with your tin of kasha in one hand and your cup of vodka in the other. And for one quiet moment, you think of absolutely nothing at all. You eat, you drink, you feel warm, you go back to the war. And 1,000 miles to the west, in a very different kitchen, a very different army was doing something much more organized, much more chemical, and in at least one particular case, very nearly pharmaceutical. The German army, the Wehrmacht, ran its ration system the way it ran nearly everything, which is to say with a great deal of paperwork, a great deal of confidence, and a fatal inability to admit when the whole thing had stopped working. On paper, it was magnificent. In practice, it was kommissbrot, meth, and eventually horses. Let's start with the paperwork, because the Germans really did love it. The Wehrmacht classified its rations into something called the Verpflegungssatz, which translates roughly to provisioning level, and there were several of them depending on where you were and what you were doing. Verpflegungssatz 1 was the heaviest, richest ration reserved for frontline combat troops actively fighting. Verpflegungssatz 2 was for troops in rear areas behind the front. Verpflegungssatz 3 was for garrison troops at home in Germany. And Verpflegungssatz 4 was for troops in office jobs and administrative duties, who were assumed, not unreasonably, to be burning fewer calories pushing a pencil across a map table. The difference between the levels was measured in grams. Grams of meat, grams of fat, grams of bread. And it was all worked out on charts in Berlin by men in neatly pressed uniforms with sharpened pencils and terrible ideas about logistics. On paper, a German frontline soldier in 1940 received roughly 750 grams of bread, 120 grams of cheese or jam, 200 grams of fresh or preserved meat, 1,500 grams of potatoes or equivalent vegetables, coffee, sugar and seasoning, along with tobacco and occasionally a small chocolate ration. On paper. Tucked somewhere on the Lanzer's person, the Lancer being the ordinary German foot soldier, roughly the German equivalent of the American G-War, or the British Tommy, was a sacred, untouchable thing called the Eisener portion, the iron ration. Every soldier carried one, and every soldier had it drilled into him that he could not open it. Not when he was hungry, not when he was tired, not when he was bored in a trench, only when an officer gave explicit permission, usually in a genuine emergency, cut off from supply, surrounded, or on some kind of extended patrol with no kitchen in reach. The Eisener portion contained roughly 300 grams of Zwieback, which is a twice-baked hard biscuit, pale, dry, about as moisture-rich as a piece of plaster, along with 200 grams of Fleischkonserve, canned preserved meat, 150 grams of preserved vegetables, and small amounts of salt and coffee substitute. The entire packet was designed to keep one man alive for one more day of hard fighting. It was sealed, recorded, inspected at kit checks, and if a soldier was caught having eaten his iron ration without permission, he could be, and occasionally was, disciplined for it. Which tells you something about the German military mind. Somewhere between food and sacred object sat a tin of pork and a packet of crackers, and the paperwork on it was real. The heart of the real, daily German ration, the thing a Lancer actually looked forward to opening his mouth for, was Kommissbrot. Kommissbrot is one of the great unsung characters of the 20th century. It is dense, dark, sour, heavy rye bread, baked in enormous rectangular loaves, each one weighing about 1.5 kilos, dark brown on the outside, almost black inside, with a crumb tight enough to slice thin. The name comes from an old German word for army provisions, and it had been feeding German soldiers, in one form or another, for more than a century before the Wehrmacht got to it. A loaf of Kommissbrot could last for days in a rucksack. It could be frozen and thawed. It could be mouldy on the outside and, with a knife, scraped back to something edible in the middle. Soldiers cursed it when the supply was late and loved it when it arrived. The smell of a fresh Kommissbrot coming out of a field bakery, sour and yeasty and warm, could, according to memoirs, make a grown Lancer weep. German field bakeries, which travelled with the army in specially equipped trucks and wagons, baked these loaves by the thousand. In the good years, 1940 and 1941, the bread was good. In 1944 and 1945, when the flour was being stretched with whatever was around, the bread got darker, heavier, stranger, and sometimes it crunched in a way that no bread should crunch. Alongside the bread, there was Erbswurst, literally pea sausage. This was a genuinely clever invention, and it was not new. It had been invented way back in 1867 by a Berlin chef named Johann Grüneberg, who compressed pea flour, bacon fat, onion powder, and seasoning into a tube shaped for no particular reason, like a sausage. The Prussian army bought the recipe almost immediately, and Erbswurst became a German military tradition for the next 80 years. You sliced off a disc of the stuff, dropped it into boiling water, stirred, and in a few minutes you had a thick, yellow, surprisingly satisfying pea soup. In the middle of a Russian winter, a hot tin cup of Erbswurst soup, salty, fatty, reconstituted from a greasy little puck, was not nothing. It was something. It was, genuinely, a piece of home, compressed into a tube and carried in a pocket. And then we come to the part of the German ration story that is so strange it sounds invented, and yet is absolutely, chemically documented. Panzer Schokolade, tank chocolate. In the late 1930s, a Berlin pharmaceutical company called Temmler developed a new pill. It was a stimulant, a synthetic amphetamine, and it was marketed under the brand name Pervitin. You could, in 1938, walk into a German pharmacy and buy Pervitin off the shelf for headaches, fatigue, depression, and the afternoon slump. Housewives took it, office workers took it. It was even baked briefly into chocolates marketed to tired mothers. Now imagine handing a pill like that to a military medical establishment that was, at that very moment, trying to figure out how to keep tank crews and pilots awake for 40 hours at a stretch during a blitzkrieg. The result was inevitable. Dr. Otto Ranke, a physiologist at the Military Medical Academy in Berlin, studied pervitin carefully in 1939 and 1940, giving it to medical students and soldiers and measuring what it did. What it did was stunning. Men who had not slept for a day and a half remained sharp, alert, almost cheerful. They reported no hunger. They felt, according to their own accounts, strong. On the basis of Ranke's reports, the Wehrmacht placed orders with Temmler, and between April of 1939 and July of 1941, the years of the great German advances through Poland, the Low Countries, France, the Balkans, and into Russia. Over 35 million pervitin tablets were distributed to the German armed forces. Tank crews chewed them. Luftwaffe pilots on long missions chewed them. Infantrymen on forced marches chewed them. And somewhere in this flood of little white pills, someone at Temmler had the perfectly German idea of pressing methamphetamine into a chocolate bar. Panzer Schokolade, tank chocolate. Bitter, dark, laced with pervitin, issued in small quantities to tank crews who needed to stay conscious inside a clanking steel box for days on end. The high lasted. The sleep deprivation accumulated. The side effects slowly began to announce themselves. Irritability, paranoia, heart palpitations, hallucinations, dependency. By late 1941, military doctors were writing worried memos about pervitin psychosis. By 1942, it had been declared a restricted drug, though in practice it was still handed out freely when operations demanded it. The blitzkrieg, in other words, was partly fought on methamphetamine. The speed of the German advance into France in 1940, the lightning strike that stunned the world, has, in the decades since, been re-examined by historians and pharmacologists alike, and the answer is not that the Germans were inhumanly tough. The answer is that they were extremely, extremely awake. Panzer Schokolade was not the only stimulant in the kit. There was also Fliegerschokolade, flight chocolate, issued to Luftwaffe air crews, and that one was caffeinated rather than meth-laced, at least most of the time. And there was Coca-Cola, which has one of the most peculiar histories of any product on Earth. Coca-Cola is a round, flat tin of dark chocolate, divided into little triangular wedges, infused with caffeine from coffee and from the cola nut. It was created for the 1936 Berlin Olympics as a kind of energy chocolate for athletes, in that particular Nazi Germany way where the state was always trying to perfect the human body. After the Olympics, it was issued to the Wehrmacht as a ration stimulant. And here is the strange part. Coca-Cola is still made today. You can walk into a shop in Berlin or order it online and receive the same round red tin with the same triangles of caffeinated dark chocolate inside that a Luftwaffe pilot might have pocketed before climbing into his Messerschmitt in 1943. The taste is essentially unchanged. A piece of the Third Reich's ration kit is, quietly, still sitting on European supermarket shelves under the radar of almost everyone. Around the edges of all of this, the bread, the pea sausage, the meth chocolate, sat the Ersatz universe. The word Ersatz in German simply means substitute. And by the middle years of the war, German soldiers and civilians alike were living in an increasingly ersatz world. Coffee was replaced with muckerfuck, a substitute brew made from roasted acorns, chicory and sometimes burnt grain, and the name muckafuck, which is not a swear. I promise, is probably a German mangling of the French phrase mocha faux, false smoker. It was bitter, it was thin, and it was not coffee. Honey was replaced with Kunsthonig, artificial honey made from sugar beet syrup and flavouring. Butter was stretched with margarine, margarine was stretched with lard, and lard was stretched with whatever fat you could render. Bread was thickened with bran, with potato flour, eventually with cellulose. There was crisp bread called knäckebrot, dry as a roof tile, which kept forever, and which everyone was politely tired of by 1944. The longer the war ran, the more ersatz the diet became, until a German soldier in the last winter of the war was, more or less, eating a simulation of the meals his father had eaten in the First World War, which had themselves been a simulation of something earlier. And then there is the grim part. The part where the whole structured, chart-filled, grams and grams German ration system collided with the reality of the Russian winter and stopped working. The Wehrmacht invaded the Soviet Union in June of 1941, assuming the campaign would be over by autumn. There were, quite literally, no serious plans for feeding the army in a Russian winter, because there was not supposed to be a Russian winter. When the winter came anyway, and it came hard in December of 1941, with temperatures dropping to -40 and beyond, the German supply system, already strained across thousands of kilometers of rail line, began to fail. Trains froze, horses died, trucks would not start, rations did not arrive, and soldiers began, slowly and then very quickly, to eat whatever they could find. They ate the draft horses that pulled their guns. They ate cats. They ate crows. They boiled harness leather and chewed it for the softened protein. They raided Russian peasant villages for potatoes and cabbage and whatever grain had been hidden in the cellars. The iron ration came out of its sealed pouch, eaten without permission. Nowhere did this collapse more completely than at Stalingrad. By late November of 1942, the German Sixth Army under Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus was surrounded in the ruins of Stalingrad, and the Luftwaffe's promise to supply them by air proved, catastrophically, impossible to keep. Bread rations inside the pocket collapsed from 600 grams a day to 300 to 200 to just about 100 grams. A hard, cold, grey slice of what veterans bitterly called Stalingrad brot, Stalingrad bread, horses. The 10,000 or so still alive inside the pocket were slaughtered and eaten, bones and all. Horse soup, horse stew, horse marrow, horse hide, boiled into a kind of gelatinous broth. When the horses ran out, soldiers chewed harness leather. In January of 1943, desperate airdrops sometimes brought in crates that, when pried open in the snow, contained not bread, not meat, but bags of peppercorns, or cases of condoms, or summer uniform insignia. Some quartermaster somewhere, loading the wrong thing onto the wrong plane with frostbitten fingers. By the end of January, Paulus's men were surrendering, not so much because they had lost the battle as because they had, quite literally, run out of anything to chew. Far to the south, in the desert, things were different but equally grim. Rommel's Afrika Korps relied heavily on captured supplies and on Italian-shipped rations because the Mediterranean supply lines were being strangled by the British. The Italian tinned meat that formed the backbone of Italian rations was labelled AM, for Amministrazione Militare, military administration. And it was, even by the standards of wartime canned meat, not good. German soldiers receiving tins of this stuff from their Italian allies took one look at the fatty, gristly, indeterminate pink substance inside and christened it Alter Mann, old man. Some joked that AM stood for Arabische Mussolini, Arab Mussolini, and spread the rumor that the contents were, in fact, mummified Egyptian donkey, which is almost certainly a slander on the donkey, the machines that brought hot food to the front line when the system worked, were called Gulaschkanonen, goulash cannons, wheeled field kitchens with a tall chimney that did look, from a distance, a little like an artillery piece. The men who cooked at them were part of the machinery of the army, quietly important in a way nobody acknowledged until the food did not arrive. A Gulaschkanone could produce a cauldron of hot stew, Eintopf, one pot, thickened with whatever was available, for a company of men, and the smell of an Eintopf coming up the line in the cold was, Wehrmacht memoirs agree, one of the rare, unambiguously good experiences of a German soldier's war. Picture a Lanza now, January of 1943, somewhere on a frozen road in Russia, between one nothing village and another. He is wrapped in whatever he has managed to steal or loot or layer. A greatcoat over a captured Russian padded jacket over a sweater from his mother. His lips are cracked. He has not had hot food in 2 days. In his pocket is a square of frozen Kommissbrot, hard as a piece of slate, which he is chewing slowly because it will not soften otherwise. On his tongue, a small white tablet is dissolving bitter. Pervitin from a foil strip he still has 3 of. And in a few minutes, his head will clear, his hands will steady, his heart will speed up, and he will march somehow another 6 kilometers down a road he does not recognize in a country he does not understand, toward a war that is already, very quietly, lost. And far away across the world, on the other side of the planet, another army was fighting another kind of war, with a ration kit so different it might as well have been from another century. That army belonged to the Emperor of Japan, and its ration system had been designed around a single, unshakable, centuries-old certainty. Rice. Not rice as one item among many. Not rice as a side dish to be tolerated between courses of something else, but rice as the very foundation of what it meant to be fed, to be human, to be Japanese. The official daily ration of the Imperial Japanese Army in 1941 began with 660 grams of rice, sometimes cut with barley into a mix called mugimeshi, because pure white rice in such quantities was a luxury even the army could not always manage. And to that base was added 210 grams of meat or fish, 600 grams of fresh vegetables, pickles of various kinds, soy sauce, miso paste, salt, sugar, and tea. On paper, this is not a bad ration. On paper, it is, in fact, one of the more sensible and balanced ration schemes of the entire war. The trouble, as you will see, was almost never with the paper. It was always with the distance between the paper and the jungle. The soldier carried his universe of food in a small, ingenious piece of kit called the hango. The hango was an oval aluminum pot, shaped a little like a kidney bean, so it would hang neatly against the hip, with a nested inner tray and a close-fitting lid that doubled as a small skillet. In this single object, a Japanese infantryman could measure his rice, cook his rice over a tiny twig fire, steam vegetables above the rice, and eat his rice when it was done. If you have ever wondered why Japanese hiking stoves and camping pots today are so quietly well designed, The answer lives partly in the hango, which was itself the inheritor of centuries of tea kettle engineering. A good soldier could make a perfectly acceptable meal of rice and miso soup in his hango in about 20 minutes, in the rain, in the dark, on a slope, with damp wood. It is the kind of small competence that wins wars, right up until the wars stop being about rice. Alongside the hango came the hardtack. In Japanese, it was called kanpan, literally dry bread, though it was not bread in any way your mouth would recognize. Kanpan was a small round biscuit, pale gold, dry as ceramic, stamped with a tiny hole in the middle like a miniature donut, and it came sealed in a tin or a waxed paper pouch. You could gnaw on kanpan for a surprising length of time before it surrendered. You could soak it in tea, or in miso broth, or in plain hot water, and it would swell slowly into something softer. And here is the small, tender detail about kanpan that I find genuinely moving. Inside every package, tucked at the bottom of the pouch, were two small extras. A little twist of sesame seeds, and a tiny paper screw of konpeito, those multicolored star-shaped sugar candies that Japanese children have been eating for 400 years, ever since Portuguese missionaries introduced the recipe in the 16th century. The sesame seeds and the konpeito had no real nutritional purpose. They were there to taste like home. They were there so that a 19-year-old conscript squatting in the dirt somewhere in Manchuria or Luzon or the Solomons could crack open his ration pouch and find, at the very bottom, 3 or 4 tiny pieces of sugar, the exact shape of the candy his grandmother used to keep in a glass jar. That is the kind of design choice that tells you something about a culture. The Germans put methamphetamine in their chocolate. The Japanese put stars of sugar in their hardtack. They were trying to solve slightly different problems. Then there was umeboshi. If you have never tasted an umeboshi, I can only describe it as the single most concentrated flavor a human being can put in their mouth without medical supervision. An umeboshi is a small plum, technically a type of Japanese apricot, that has been salted, dried, and pickled with red shiso leaves until it becomes a wrinkled, crimson, impossibly sour and salty object, roughly the size of a gumball. It is the taste of vinegar, of sea salt, of summer fruit, and of a very aggressive grandmother, all compressed into a single bite. Japanese troops carried umeboshi for 2 reasons. First, it was believed, with some justification, to prevent food poisoning and to kill off mild stomach infections, because the plum is extremely acidic and does genuinely inhibit bacteria. Second, and more importantly, it was patriotic. If you took a perfect mound of white rice, packed it into a round ball, and pressed a single red umeboshi into the center, you had created, in miniature, the flag of Japan. The white circle of rice, the red sun of the plum. This was called the Hinomaru Bento, the sun flag lunch, and it was the simplest possible midday meal a soldier could pack. And it was also, every time he unwrapped it, a quiet, edible reminder of exactly whose side he was on. Entire generations of Japanese soldiers ate the flag of Japan, one bite at a time, from a waxed paper wrapper. For stretches of harder campaigning, there was chikara meshi, strength rice, a pressed dried rice cake that could be crumbled into boiling water to reconstitute. There were tins of gyuniku no yamato ni, beef stewed in the Japanese style with ginger, soy sauce and sugar, which was genuinely delicious and which soldiers loved when they could get it, which was not often. There were small tins of tsukudani, Seafood and seaweed simmered down in soy and mirin into a salty, intense relish that you could sprinkle across a mound of plain rice and suddenly have a meal. There was green tea, always in small waxed packets. On paper, if you put all these things together, the Japanese soldier ate better than almost any of his Allied counterparts. And then he was sent to Guadalcanal. Guadalcanal is a small, hot, mountainous, jungle-choked island in the Solomons, roughly the shape of a drowned moth. And in August of 1942, the United States Marines landed on its northern shore and took an unfinished Japanese airfield. The Imperial Japanese Army, to put it mildly, did not react well. Over the following 6 months, the Japanese tried and failed repeatedly to retake the airfield. They sent troops piecemeal in destroyer runs that the Americans nicknamed the Tokyo Express, and those troops arrived with rifles, ammunition, and almost no food. The plan had been to capture the American supply dumps. That plan did not work. What happened next entered Japanese military history under a single bitter pun. The word for Guadalcanal in Japanese was written with kanji chosen for their sound rather than their meaning, ga-dal-ka-na-ru. Soldiers took the first character, ga, and replaced it with another kanji pronounced the same way. The character meaning hunger. Gato, Idao, Starvation Island. The new name spread through the army, whispered in letters, written in diaries, because a name like that tells you everything you need to know without saying any of it out loud. Over 20,000 Japanese soldiers died on Guadalcanal. The great majority of them did not die from American bullets. They died from hunger, from dysentery, from malaria, from beriberi, from a slow wasting that reduced men to almost transparent ghosts before it finally reduced them to nothing. Japanese diaries from the island chart the descent in a quiet, almost clinical way. First, they ate their remaining rice, strictly rationed, 2 handfuls a day, then 1, then half. Then they ate the local taro roots and yams where they could find them. Then they boiled and ate the tender inner pith of certain palm trees. Then they ate grass and specific jungle leaves thought to be safe, and lizards and wild rats. Then, in some documented cases that Japanese officers themselves treated as a profound crime, and for which some men were court-martialed and executed, they ate the flesh of enemy dead. Imperial General Headquarters forbade it explicitly because the army's own honor could not survive the rumor. But in a jungle where men weighed 60 pounds, where bones protruded through uniforms that hung like draped sheets, the prohibition could not always hold. When the Imperial Navy finally came to evacuate the survivors in February of 1943, in a withdrawal operation called Kego, the men who were carried aboard the destroyers looked to their own horrified comrades like something out of a temple painting of hungry ghosts. Many weighed less than 40 kilograms. Some could not stand. Some could not speak. They had held out on Starvation Island for 6 months, and they had held out in the end almost entirely on the idea of holding out, because there had been nothing else left to live on. The last grains of rice had been divided by count, not by weight. Guadalcanal was the first of the Starvation Islands. It would not be the last. In New Guinea, General Hatazo Adachi's 18th Army was cut off from reliable resupply almost from the moment it arrived. New Guinea is, I want to stress this gently, an extremely unforgiving piece of geography, a wall of mountains covered in the densest rainforest on Earth, bisected by rivers that flood without warning, carpeted in mud that swallows boots and populated with insects that carry every tropical disease ever catalogued. Into this environment, the Imperial Japanese Army marched with its neat ration tables of 660 grams of rice, and within months, those ration tables were fiction. Whole battalions dissolved into the forest, reduced to eating sago pith, tree kangaroos, tree bark, insect larvae, and whatever leaves the local villagers indicated would not kill them. Beriberi, the thiamine deficiency that makes your legs swell and your heart weaken and your nerves misfire, stalked the columns. Dysentery emptied men from the inside out. Japanese veterans of the New Guinea campaign later estimated that for every man killed by Australian or American fire, somewhere between 5 and 10 were killed by hunger and disease. Whole regiments walked into the mountains, and whole regiments simply did not walk out. And then there was Burma. In early 1944, Lieutenant General Renya Mutaguchi launched an offensive into India toward the towns of Imphal and Kohima, convinced that his troops could overrun British and Indian positions and then live off the captured stockpiles. He called these imagined stockpiles, with grim humour, Churchill rations. His men were issued only about 3 weeks of food and told that the rest of the campaign would be fed by the enemy. The campaign lasted considerably longer than 3 weeks. The British held. The monsoon arrived. Japanese supply lines, never robust, were severed completely by rain and flooding rivers and mud that locked vehicles in place for days at a time. And the soldiers of Mutaguchi's 15th Army began once again to starve. They ate monkeys from the canopy. They ate snakes. They ate wild bananas and the inner bark of certain trees. At the end, when the retreat finally began, the long, broken withdrawal across mountain passes and through leech-infested forest that the survivors would forever after call the Road of Bones. They ate the pack elephants that had carried their artillery. Over 30,000 Japanese soldiers died of starvation and disease in the Imphal-Kohima campaign. It is one of the great, largely forgotten catastrophes of the war, and the root of it, beyond all the tactical errors, was a ration plan that began with the words, "We will feed ourselves from their supplies." Behind all of this, behind Guadalcanal, behind New Guinea, behind the Road of Bones, was the quiet, invisible, decisive work of American submarines. Japan was an island nation, and Japan's armies in the Pacific were island-dependent armies, and every grain of rice those armies ate had, at some point, to cross water in a ship. American submarine warfare in the Pacific, beginning slowly in 1942 and reaching a terrifying efficiency by 1944, sank that merchant fleet. Tanker by tanker, freighter by freighter, rice sack by rice sack, Japan's maritime supply chain was unstitched from beneath it. By 1945, civilian rations in Tokyo had fallen to around 1,500 calories a day, and school children were being sent to pick acorns and pine bark for flour. The hango and the kanpan and the kompeito were still officially the standard. In practice, soldiers in the last scattered garrisons of the Pacific were eating whatever they could catch, grow or negotiate from local villagers. Some of them, of course, never stopped. The most famous were Hiru Onoda, who remained at his post in the Philippine jungle until 1974, and Shoichi Yokoi, who was discovered in Guam in 1972, each having survived for decades on coconuts, wild taro, river shrimp, frogs, and rats, quietly waiting for orders that were never going to come. Their ration kits had long since rotted, their canpan tins long since emptied. They had become, essentially, their own quartermasters, foraging a jungle diet that would have horrified their training officers. And they had done it not because they were fanatics exactly, but because nobody had ever told them, in the correct words, that they could stop. And so, to leave the Japanese theatre in the image it deserves, picture a soldier you will never meet. He is somewhere on a narrow jungle trail in New Guinea, late 1943, and he has not seen a supply dump in weeks. His uniform hangs loose around a body that used to fit it. His rifle is heavy in his hands in a way it did not used to be. He has stopped in a small clearing to rest, and he is rummaging slowly, almost absent-mindedly, in the bottom of his ration pouch, the way you might pat your pockets for loose change. His fingers find nothing at first. Then, at the very bottom seam, caught in the folded corner, he feels 3 tiny round objects, hard and faceted. Competo. 3 star-shaped pieces of sugar candy, the last of the pouch, probably packed in a factory in Osaka 10 months earlier by a woman he will never meet. He picks them out carefully, one at a time, and he places them on his tongue. And for a few seconds, in a jungle where nothing else in the world tastes sweet, he has, once again, 3 small stars of home. And then they are gone, and the trail goes on, and the war goes on, and the quartermaster's beautiful, sensible, paper-perfect ration system is already, far behind him, starting to forget his name. Before we leave the food supply entirely and follow other armies into other strange kitchens, there is one more cluster of stories that deserves the candlelight. The smaller, quieter, sometimes funnier ration tales of armies you may not think of first when you think of the Second World War. We begin, as we so often do on this channel, with Italy, because the Italian soldier's story in the Second World War is, depending on your mood, either a tragedy of supply and corruption or one of the strangest exercises in wishful thinking ever put on paper. And it really does begin on paper. On paper, the daily ration for a soldier in the Regio Esercito, the Royal Italian Army, looked like something out of a small, cheerful trattoria. 750 grams of bread, 375 grams of pasta or rice, a generous 250 grams of meat, cheese, olive oil, coffee, a quarter litre of wine, pickled vegetables, real tomato conserve where it could be got. Read that aloud to a British Tommy chewing a hardtack biscuit in the desert, and you would very probably cause a small international incident. In practice, the Italian soldier on the front line, particularly in North Africa, and later on the Eastern Front, and later still in the ruins of his own country, was among the worst-fed men in uniform in the entire war. The supply system was overburdened. The shipping lanes across the Mediterranean were hunted relentlessly by British submarines and aircraft out of Malta. And the ration warehouses were, to put it delicately, an environment in which a certain quantity of olive oil and tinned cheese had a way of quietly walking off and finding its way to the black market in Naples or Tripoli. A ration on paper is not the same thing as a ration in a mess tin, and nobody in the Second World War learned this more painfully than an Italian private in the Western Desert. What he did receive, in grim quantity, was the infamous AM tin. AM stood for Amministrazione Militare, military administration, and it was stamped on tins of fatty, gristly, pinkish beef that the Italian soldiers themselves regarded with a kind of weary, comic despair. They joked that AM stood for Asino Morto, dead, donkey. The Germans in the Afrika Korps, who had the great misfortune to be partially supplied by the same Italian system, translated the joke into their own language and called it alter man, old man, muttering that whoever the old man had been, he had clearly died of natural causes several years before being canned. The texture was the thing. It was not quite stew, and not quite corned beef, and not quite anything a person would willingly describe as food. In desert heat, the fat liquefied and puddled. In winter, cold it set into a solid, fist-sized lump you had to hack out of the tin with a bayonet. Generations of veterans carried the memory of AM, the way one carries the memory of a bad dentist, without affection, but with a certain grudging respect for its capacity to stay with you. Alongside the AM tin sat the galletta, the Italian military biscuit, thinner and more refined-looking than British hardtack, but every bit as murderous on a tired tooth. Each galletta was stamped with the Cross of Savoy, the royal emblem, which must have been some comfort as you tried to gnaw through it by firelight. Italian soldiers in North Africa devised the same basic survival trick their British enemies devised a few miles away across the minefields. They soaked the biscuit in whatever liquid was to hand: coffee, wine, water from a canteen, tomato juice from a captured British tin. And then, because they were Italians and could not entirely help themselves, they sometimes crumbled the softened galletta into a little cup of olive oil and garlic, and pretended, for a single lunch, that they were somewhere near home. The wine ration was the one element of the Italian system that, against all odds, actually worked. A quarter-litre a day of rough red table wine. In the desert, of course, it soured in the heat, turning into something closer to vinegar by the time it reached the mouth. In the Alpine campaigns, it sometimes froze into a pink slush in its bottle. But it arrived, more often than not, which is more than can be said for a great many other items on that hopeful paper ration. And for an Italian conscript 1,000 kilometers from his village, a small tin cup of bad wine was not just a drink. It was a link. It was a quiet way of staying, in his own mind, exactly who he had been before somebody handed him a rifle. From the Italian mess tin, we drift gently north and west into the peculiar world of the Free French. The Free French forces, those soldiers who had followed General de Gaulle into exile after 1940 and who now fought under the Cross of Lorraine from bases in Britain, Africa and the Levant, were supplied, largely, by the Americans. And the Americans, with their usual mixture of generosity and bewilderment at foreign tastes, simply handed them the standard American ration kit and assumed everyone would be delighted. Reader, they were not delighted. A French soldier, even a French soldier who had been living on sand and grit for 2 years, did not consider American coffee to be coffee. He considered it, variously, to be dirty water, hot tea's sad cousin, or the sort of liquid one might use to clean a carburetor. He regarded Spam, which the Americans by now could barely stand either, with an expression of profound philosophical disappointment. He named it, quite simply, Singe, monkey. And every time he could, he walked down to a village market in Algeria or Tunisia or liberated France and tried to barter his way toward a real baguette, a real piece of cheese, a real glass of rough red wine. Anything, anything at all that did not come out of a can stamped in English. The French Foreign Legion, by long tradition, had always fed itself partly through improvisation, buying from local markets, supplementing the official ration with whatever the regiment's cook could negotiate in 3 different languages before dawn. In Syria, in North Africa, in Indochina, the Legion mess had always been a miniature empire of unofficial arrangements, and the Second World War simply continued the tradition. A Legion cook is the sort of man who can turn a tin of Spam, a handful of desert herbs, a bag of semolina, and a live chicken acquired under circumstances best left unexamined into a lunch that a general would compliment. These are the quiet, unrewarded geniuses of every war, and we will come back to them in spirit before this night is over. Meanwhile, in occupied France itself, the civilian ration was an entirely separate kind of grim. Paris, under German occupation, was a city on roughly 1,200 calories a day for adults, a number that sounds like a modern weight loss plan, and that actually represents, in sustained practice over years, a slow, unglamorous, household-by-household erosion of health. Real coffee was essentially unobtainable, so Parisians drank chicory, roasted, ground, and bitter, and pretended. Real bread was replaced by pain national, the so-called national loaf, a heavy grey brick made of wheat flour stretched with rye, barley, and sometimes even bean flour, depending on what the Germans had not already requisitioned that month. Meat, when it appeared at all, arrived at the official rate of roughly 120 grams per person per week, which is about the weight of one small hamburger patty spread across 7 days in the city that had invented fine dining. Butter, cheese, eggs, wine, sugar. All rationed, all scarce, all traded at prices that nobody in 1938 could have imagined. The French civilian learned, with the same stubborn ingenuity that every occupied population learns, to stretch, to substitute, to queue for hours, and to quietly despise the men who had made the queue necessary. Now we shift again, across the Mediterranean and out into the wider Commonwealth, because this is where the ration story becomes truly, charmingly global. The British Army in the Second World War was not just British. It was Australian and New Zealander and Canadian and South African and Indian and West Indian and West African and East African and Fijian. And every one of those contingents brought its own ideas about what food ought to taste like. And every one of them encountered the standard British ration with a different facial expression. The Australians, the famous rats of Tobruk, the diggers in New Guinea, the men of the Western Desert, developed perhaps the most colourful ration vocabulary of any army on earth. They hated the Argentine tinned mutton we have already buried politely in the sand. They nicknamed tinned herring in tomato sauce goldfish, because opening the tin revealed a small, pale, startled-looking fish floating in a puddle of pink, and they ate goldfish with enthusiasm during the siege of Tobruk in 1941, when they were locked in that coastal fortress by Rommel's advancing Africa Corps and had to live on whatever the Navy could run in through the harbour under air attack. The rats, in fact, developed a deep and lasting affection for captured Italian supplies, for Italian sardines packed in oil, for tinned Italian sheep's cheese, for hard Italian coffee, even for the despised AM tin when nothing better was on offer, because any food that was not British ration food was, in some small way, a holiday. The New Zealanders carried Vegemite. I know, I can hear you wincing from here. But I must tell you, with the professional neutrality I bring to all foreign condiments on this channel, that for a Kiwi soldier far from home, The salty, dark, yeasty smear of Vegemite on a ration biscuit was not merely a spread. It was a small, bitter taste of everything he was fighting for. He would part with his cigarettes before he parted with his Vegemite, which tells you rather a lot about both Vegemite and cigarettes. The Canadians, bless them, had inherited from their Arctic and frontier traditions the idea of pemmican, that ancient mixture of dried lean meat pounded into fibers, combined with rendered fat and sometimes dried berries, pressed into a hard, dense, infinitely preservable block. In theory, pemmican was the perfect military food, calorie-dense, shelf-stable, light to carry. In practice, the mass-produced wartime Canadian pemmican was so universally disliked that in Arctic and subarctic operations, it tended to end up in the sled dogs' feeding bowls rather than the soldiers. A Canadian trooper would look at his pemmican brick, look at the husky chewing it with enthusiasm, and quietly conclude that the husky had the better ration scheme. The South Africans brought biltong, air-dried cured meat, seasoned with coriander and vinegar and salt, cut into long dark strips. And biltong, unlike pemmican, survived its wartime journey with its dignity intact. In North Africa, a South African unit with a proper supply of biltong was the envy of every mess tent within smelling distance. The Indian Army, meanwhile, operated the most elaborate and culturally careful ration system of any force in the war. Ration depots had to separate, with genuine seriousness, the dietary needs of Hindu soldiers who would not eat beef, Muslim soldiers who required halal slaughtered meat, Sikh soldiers with their own observances, and Gurkhas who preferred goat. Atta flour for chapatis, dal for the evening meal, ghee for cooking, carefully sourced spices. This was the ration of the largest volunteer army in human history, and running it required a quartermaster corps with the patience of saints and the filing system of a small country. Running somewhere through the edges of this story, because they deserve a place in any honest account of the war, are the Polish Second Corps under General Władysław Anders. These were men who had been deported in many cases from eastern Poland into the Soviet Gulag system after 1939, and who had been released after 1941 when the Soviet Union suddenly found itself on the Allied side and needed every able body it could spare. They marched out of Russia, across Persia, into the British supply system in the Middle East, and eventually into the Italian campaign, where, at Monte Cassino in 1944, they earned a piece of military immortality. Along the way, they adopted, in Iran, a Syrian brown bear cub whom they named Wojtek. Wojtek was formerly enlisted as a private in the 22nd Artillery Supply Company, complete with paybook and serial number, because regulations prohibited animals in combat zones, but did not, it turned out, prohibit bears who happened to be soldiers. Wojtek drank beer. He smoked, or rather ate, cigarettes when they were offered. He carried crates of artillery shells at Monte Cassino, and he lived on the same ration as his comrades, which is how we know from multiple Polish veteran memoirs that he was particularly fond of tinned fruit and deeply uninterested in bully beef. Even bears, apparently, had opinions about the British ration system. We must mention, too, the African colonial troops whose story is too often quietly folded away into a footnote. The tirailleurs sénégalais, the Senegalese sharpshooters, recruited from across French West Africa, fought in the French defense in 1940 in the liberation of the south of France in 1944. and in the brutal Italian campaign, and were fed largely on rice, peanut oil, and whatever the French supply system could provide, which was often not very much. The King's African Rifles, recruited across British East Africa, marched through Burma and Madagascar on a ration built around posho, stiff maize meal porridge, beans and occasional meat. These were soldiers fighting somebody else's war on somebody else's continent on food that was, at best, adequate, and they did it with a quiet competence that their home empires did not, at the time, adequately thank them for. Sensory detail, because you've earned it after all that geography. Picture the smell of pasta asciutta cooking in a little pot of water on a Libyan dune, the steam rising into a sky that has not seen a cloud in 3 months. The hiss of a primus stove in a New Zealand bivouac in the Italian Apennines, the blue flame flickering around a billy can of lamb stew, the taste of desert sand in every single mouthful, because the desert sand got into absolutely everything, and no ration was ever fully free of it. A cup of chicory coffee in a Paris cafe where the waiter has just looked silently at a German officer and then silently at the sugar bowl and silently withheld the bowl. An Indian havildar breaking a warm chapati in half by a fire in the hills outside Kohima. A Polish private feeding a corner of his ration biscuit to a large, patient, slightly sticky bear. And for a closing image, because all of these people deserve one, let me leave you with an Italian prisoner of war. He is in a British camp somewhere in the Egyptian desert in the spring of 1943. He has surrendered several weeks earlier, somewhere in Tunisia, at the end of a campaign in which he had not been fed properly in months. He is thin. His uniform is not quite a uniform anymore. He is sitting at a long wooden table in the shade of a canvas awning, and a British orderly has just set in front of him a full mess tin of bully beef, warm potatoes, a thick slice of white bread, and a mug of strong sweet tea. The Italian looks down at the plate. He picks up the bread first, slowly, and holds it in both hands. And then, very quietly, so that nobody at the table can quite tell what has just happened, he begins to cry. Not from sadness, not exactly from relief. From the plain, bewildering fact of being given a meal, any meal, by the army that had just defeated his own. In a war full of strange foods and stranger cruelties, this, too, is part of what a ration was. Sometimes it was the first kind thing that anyone in uniform had done for you in a very long time. And now, having wandered across every major army and quite a few minor ones, we step away from the mess tins and the field kitchens and the shared meals between enemies, and we walk, quietly, into a place that almost no soldier in the Second World War ever saw. We walk into the laboratories, because behind every ration we have tasted tonight, behind every waxed box and every olive drab tin and every tragic tube of pea sausage, there was a room full of men in white coats, standing under fluorescent lights, weighing ingredients on small brass scales, and genuinely, earnestly, trying to solve the oldest logistical problem in human history. How do you carry food a long way, store it a long time, keep it edible, keep it nourishing, and get it into the hand of a tired, scared, hungry young person on the far side of the world? The Second World War, more than any conflict before it, turned that question into a science. And the science, as sciences tend to be, was sometimes brilliant, sometimes ridiculous, and occasionally, and I mean this, slightly alarming. Let us begin with the egg. The humble chicken egg, perishable, Fragile, absolutely central to the Western diet, and almost impossible to ship in bulk across an ocean without half of it becoming a smell you do not want on your ship. American food scientists, particularly at firms like Henningsen Foods, perfected during the war the industrial spray drying of whole eggs into a fine, pale yellow powder that could be sealed in tins, shipped anywhere, and reconstituted with warm water into something that, in theory, was scrambled egg. I say in theory because the reality was rubbery, faintly sulphurous, and possessed of an afterbite that British soldiers described as somewhere between old sock and new tire. The Soviets, who received powdered eggs by the ton under Lend-Lease, were generally of the opinion that the powder was not food, so much as a chemical practical joke the Americans had shipped over by mistake. Some Red Army cooks figured out that if you mixed powdered egg with a great deal of chopped onion and fried it very aggressively in lard, you could almost convince yourself you were eating a proper meal. Almost. Next came powdered milk, which in its most famous American form was sold under the brand name Klim, which is, if you say it slowly, simply the word milk spelled backwards, because 1940s marketing had not yet reached its peak sophistication. Klim was a Borden product, and Klim went everywhere. It went into ration packs, into hospital kitchens, into children's cups in occupied Europe via the Red Cross. It was beloved by mothers and tolerated by soldiers, and, when mixed properly, tasted like milk that had recently been introduced to the concept of milk without quite getting the reference. Then came powdered potatoes, which in 1942 were a genuinely novel piece of technology. Flaked dehydrated potato that reconstituted into mashed potato. Sort of, if you did not examine it too closely. Powdered soup, powdered onion, powdered garlic, powdered gravy mix, powdered everything. And then, because the scientists were on a roll, they powdered lemons. The American sea ration for a while included little foil packets of lemon crystals, a yellow-green powder that was supposed to mix with water into a refreshing lemonade. It was, instead, so sour, so chemically aggressive, and so relentlessly artificial in flavor that soldiers discovered its true and higher purpose. They used it to clean floors. There are documented accounts of GIs scrubbing jeep hoods, mess tables, and barracks floors with reconstituted lemon crystals because it turned out to be a rather effective mild acid cleaner. The drink, meanwhile, went mostly untouched. An entire wartime chemistry program funded by the United States Treasury and its greatest military achievement was discovering a new kind of Lysol. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the British were running perhaps the most fascinating food science operation of the entire war, and running it through one of the more unlikely war heroes of the 20th century. His name was Frederick Marquis, the first Earl of Woolton, and he was the Minister of Food from 1940 to 1943. Lord Woolton was a retired department store executive who was handed the job of feeding an island nation under submarine blockade, and he turned out to be astonishingly quietly good at it. He invented a communication style, warm, straightforward, almost grandfatherly, that told British housewives exactly what was coming into port that month and exactly what they could and could not buy. He gave his name to Woolton Pie, a meatless concoction of potatoes, carrots, swedes, turnips, and oatmeal, bound with vegetable stock and capped with a pastry or potato crust, which he pushed onto the nation with the enthusiasm of a man who genuinely believed in root vegetables. The pie was not loved. It was eaten. There is a difference. He also gave his backing to the national loaf, a wholemeal bread, grey-brown in colour, dense in texture, made from a flour blend that included wheat, rye, and sometimes bean flour, preserved more of the grain than white bread, and was, by every measure that 1942 could quantify, healthier than what Britain had been eating before the war. It was also, and I say this with affection, deeply unpopular. Housewives complained that it went stale in a day. Bakers complained that it gummed up their machines. Children complained that it tasted like the floor of a mill. And the nation ate it anyway, stubbornly. For years, because the nation was stubborn and because Lord Woolton had asked nicely. Out in the field, the science kept going. British and American researchers both worked on dehydrated meat bars, compressed bricks of dried lean meat, and rendered fat, sometimes with a little sugar, which could be eaten raw in an emergency or crumbled into boiling water to make a kind of broth. The British version often went under the old name pemmican, borrowed from the North American fur trade. The American version was simply called a meat bar. Both were carried by paratroopers, commandos, pilots, and anyone who might suddenly find themselves a long way from a kitchen. The U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps designed a whole family of specialist rations for specialist situations. The jungle ration, issued in the early Pacific campaigns, was lightweight and compact, packed with concentrated cheese, peanut bars, hard candy, and, somewhat gloriously, fruitcake. Because it turned out that fruitcake, that much-mocked Christmas object, was one of the most robust shelf-stable foods ever invented, and a fruitcake could survive a drop from a plane, a month in a jungle, and 3 weeks in a pack before being eaten with something like gratitude. The mountain ration, issued to units like the 10th Mountain Division fighting up the spine of Italy in 1944 and 1945, was calorically denser, cold-weather adapted, and included items like cereal bars and extra fat, because a man climbing an Apennine ridge in the snow burns calories faster than a man sitting in a tent. Then there was the part of the ration world that I find, personally, the most poignant: the life raft rations. The abandoned ship ration, the emergency sea ration. Small, waxed, sealed packets that sat year after year in the lockers of life rafts and lifeboats aboard every Allied ship and in the survival packs of every aircrew waiting patiently for the worst day of somebody's life. Inside, malted milk tablets, hard candy, compressed pemmican, sea biscuits, sometimes a little chocolate. Everything chosen to be compact, calorie-dense, thirst-minimizing, and edible under the kind of circumstances you do not like to think about for too long. Downed pilots in the Pacific survived for days and occasionally weeks on these rations, supplemented by fish caught with the little hook and line kit included in every life raft, and occasionally by small sharks caught by hand, which, as a method of dinner procurement, I do not recommend. The malted milk tablet, that small chalky disc of dried milk solids and malted barley, was the quiet hero of hundreds of survival stories. It was nobody's favorite food. It was nobody's idea of a meal. But if you were alone on a rubber raft in the middle of the ocean, the malted milk tablet was the small sweet reminder that somebody, somewhere, had thought about you. Secret operations food was its own strange world. The British Special Operations Executive, the SOE, and its American cousin, the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, ran agents into occupied Europe, and those agents needed rations that would not give them away. A chocolate bar with an American wrapper in a French village was, in 1944, potentially fatal. So the SOE produced ration items with French labels, Dutch labels, Norwegian labels, chocolate bars that looked as though they had come from a Lion shop, biscuits that looked as though they had come from an Amsterdam bakery. The packaging was half the mission. Inside was often standard British compressed food. Outside was a careful piece of theatre. And then, because we cannot have a section on wartime experiments without mentioning the pharmaceuticals, we return briefly to the pills. We have already talked about German Pervitin and the methamphetamine in the chocolate. The Allies, it must be said, had their own version. American B-17 crews flying daylight raids over Germany, 12-hour missions in freezing, unheated bombers at 20,000 feet under constant flak and fighter attack, were routinely issued Benzedrine, a brand-name form of amphetamine, in both inhaler and tablet form, to keep them alert on the long flight home. British Bomber Command used similar stimulants. Nobody on either side really understood in 1943 how much long-term harm they might be doing. Everyone understood on every side that a tired pilot at 20,000 feet was a dead pilot. Somewhere in American laboratories, researchers also developed combat stimulant gum, a chewing gum laced with caffeine and dextrose, meant to give a foot soldier a quick push during a night march or a sentry shift. There was, reportedly, a US Navy project to develop a candy bar for sonar operators on submarines, with a wrapper engineered to unwrap silently, because a crinkle of cellophane in the wrong moment could give away the position of a submarine to a listening destroyer. Whether the silent wrapper candy bar was ever fully standardized or merely an enthusiastic experiment is still, to be honest, a matter of polite disagreement among ration historians, which is a real subculture and a lovely one to fall down the rabbit hole of on a quiet Tuesday evening. When the airborne forces dropped into Arnhem in September 1944, Operation Market Garden, the bridge too far, every paratrooper carried a small, compact ration pack designed to fit into the pocket of his smock. Because, as it turned out, you do not have time, falling out of a plane, to carry a large picnic basket. On the stranger fringes of the scientific war, there were projects that feel, in hindsight, almost too odd to be real. Nazi Germany, desperate for fats because its blockade-choked economy could not import enough edible oil, poured resources into a process called Kohlenwasserstoff synthese, the synthesis of edible fats from coal. They actually, genuinely produced small quantities of synthetic fat from coal tar derivatives. It was technically edible. It was, by all accounts, not pleasant. It did not feed the Reich in any meaningful quantity, but it existed, and it sits in the history books as a small monument to the lengths a besieged war economy will go to. The Soviets, for their part, had the brilliant and slightly mad Alexander Nesmyanov, a chemist who during and after the war led research into synthetic foods, artificial caviar made from gelatin and dye, artificial meat made from plant proteins, experimental food systems intended to feed a country that had lost a generation of its farmers. Nesmyanov's synthetic caviar, fascinatingly, eventually became a real commercial product in the Soviet Union decades later, sold in small jars to households that could not afford the real thing. A piece of wartime desperation that somehow turned quietly into a peacetime pantry staple. The British, more practically, poured enormous resources into agricultural science. experimenting with feeding cattle on molasses and grass silage, breeding faster-growing pigs, developing new hybrids of wheat that could ripen in cooler, wetter summers. They were, in effect, preparing for the long, grim arithmetic of a nation that could no longer assume it would be fed by its empire. The Americans, late in the war, quietly updated the K-ration to include items like corned beef hash, sausage patties, spaghetti with meat sauce, and chicken and vegetables, a deliberate attempt to break the terrible monotony of meat and beans, meat and beans, meat and beans that had driven so many Guadalcanal veterans to a state of ration fatigue they would never quite forget. Variety, the quartermasters had finally realized, was not a luxury. It was a weapon. All of this work, all of this strange, quiet, earnest science was coordinated to a remarkable degree at a place most of us have never heard of. The U.S. Army Quartermaster Subsistence Research and Development Laboratory, which after the war moved to Natick, Massachusetts, and became the Natick Laboratories, which still to this day designs the food the American soldier eats in the field. In a long, low-ceilinged building under fluorescent lights, men and women in white coats sat at stainless steel tables and taste-tested compressed meat bars, evaluated the mouthfeel of dehydrated cheese, debated the aroma of reconstituted beef stew, and filled out small paper forms with scores on a 9-point scale. Imagine the quiet of that room. Imagine the faint industrial smell of food that has been pushed too hard by science. Imagine a chemist with a clipboard taking one small, careful bite of a biscuit developed for a soldier he will never meet, in a war zone he will never see, and writing in neat pencil a single number that will decide whether that biscuit goes into a ration pack or back to the drawing board. There is something deeply, quietly moving about that image. Somewhere under the fluorescent lights, a scientist is trying, with all the tools of modern chemistry and all the patience of a professional, to make a boy in a foxhole feel, for one small moment, a little less far from home. That, in the end, is what all of this science was for. Not the clim, not the lemon crystals, not the synthetic coal fat, not even, really, the pemmican in the life raft. What the laboratories were building, mouthful by mouthful, was the smallest possible piece of comfort, packed into the smallest possible box and sent as far as anyone could send it. And sometimes it worked, and sometimes it did not. And sometimes a soldier opened his little waxed package and found, against all odds, something that tasted almost like the kitchen he had left behind. And if, by now, you have drifted off somewhere between the malted milk tablets and the quiet laboratory in Massachusetts, that is perfectly all right. That is genuinely the point. You do not need to remember any of this in the morning. You do not need to quiz yourself on the difference between a compo pack and a K-ration. The stories will still be here. But if you are still with me, just for a moment, let me pull the camera back. Tonight we have drifted, slowly, through the strange kitchens of a war that covered most of the world. We stood in a Minneapolis grocery store with Ancel Keys, picking out sausages and biscuits for 50 cents. We cracked open a tin of Fray Bentos bully beef under a desert sun and watched the fat run in rivulets. We held a square of Soviet black bread in one hand and a tin cup of 100 grams of vodka in the other, while the snow fell over Stalingrad. We tasted the bitterness of Panzer Chocolate on a frozen Russian road. We opened a Kanpan packet in a New Guinea jungle and found 3 tiny Competo candies at the bottom. We wept, briefly, over a plate of bully beef in an Italian prisoner of war camp. We bobbed in a rubber raft in the Pacific, sucking slowly on a malted milk tablet. And we watched, under fluorescent lights in Natick, as a quiet scientist took one careful bite of a biscuit and wrote down a number. These were stubborn people, stubborn cooks stirring cauldrons of kasha in the snow, stubborn quartermasters stacking crates in warehouses at 2 in the morning, stubborn soldiers who cursed their rations and ate them anyway and somehow kept walking. Nobody gave them medals for it. Nobody made films about the men who peeled potatoes and hauled flour sacks and cleaned out field kitchens at the end of a long day. But armies march on their stomachs, as the saying goes, and those stomachs were filled by a quiet, unglamorous, endless labour that nobody ever quite wrote the history of. They were doing their best, with what they had, with what could be grown, canned, dehydrated, shipped, dropped, or dug up. They were not choosing to eat steak and kidney pudding out of a tin. They were not choosing to chew tank chocolate for 40 hours. They were simply, stubbornly surviving, and sometimes against every odd, sharing a laugh over how bad it all tasted. Tonight, as you lie in your warm bed, with your refrigerator humming quietly down the hall and a whole grocery store waiting for you in the morning, maybe spare a quiet thought for them. For the G, trading his meat unit for a single fresh egg. For the Soviet private warming his hands over a field kitchen's chimney. For the Japanese infantryman with his 3 last pieces of candy. For every person who ever opened a small waxed box in a terrible place and found inside the smallest possible piece of home. And now, one last image. A candle burning low in an empty mess tent at dawn. The crates stacked against the canvas wall. The ration tins glinting dully in the pale cold light. The long tables wiped clean. The kettles cooling. And all the soldiers, at last, gone to rest. Sleep well.